It is morning at the Youngers' apartment. Their small dwelling on the south side of Chicago has 2 bedrooms, one for Mama and Benita, and one for Ruth and Walter Lee. Travis sleeps on the couch in the living room. The only window is in their small kitchen, and they share a bathroom in the hall with their neighbors. The stage directions indicate that the furniture, though apparently once chosen with care, is now very worn and faded. Ruth gets up first and after some noticeable difficulty, rouses Travis and Walter as she makes breakfast. While Travis gets ready in the communal bathroom, Ruth and Walter talk in the kitchen. They do not seem happy, yet they engage in some light humor. They keep mentioning a check. Walter scans the front page of the newspaper and reads that another bomb was set off, and Ruth responds with indifference. Travis asks them for money. He is supposed to bring 50 cents to school, and Ruth says that they do not have it. His persistent nagging quickly irritates her. Walter, however, gives Travis an entire $1 while staring at Ruth. Travis then leaves for school, and Walter tells Ruth that he wants to use a check to invest in a liquor store with a few of his friends. Walter and Ruth continue to argue about their unhappy lives, a dialogue that Ruth cuts short by telling her husband, "Eat your eggs, they gonna be cold." Benita gets up next, and after discovering that the bathroom is occupied by someone from another family, engages in a verbal joust with Walter. He thinks that she should be doing something more womanly than studying medicine, especially since her tuition will cut into the check, which is the insurance payment for their father's death. Benita argues that the money belongs to Mama and that Mama has the right to decide how it is spent. Walter then leaves for his job as a chauffeur. He has to ask Ruth for money to get to work because the money he gave Travis was his car fare. Mama enters and goes directly to a small plant that she keeps just outside the kitchen window. She expresses sympathy for her grandson, Travis, while she questions Ruth's ability to care for him properly. She asks Ruth what she would do with the money, which amounts to $10,000. For once, Ruth seems to be on Walter's side. She thinks that if Mama gives him some of the money he might regain his happiness and confidence, which are 2 things Ruth feels she can no longer provide for Walter. Mama, though, feels morally repulsed by the idea of getting into the liquor business. Instead, she wants to move to a house with a lawn on which Travis can play. Owning a house had always been a dream she had shared with her husband, and now that he is gone she nurtures this dream even more powerfully. Mama and Ruth begin to tease Benita about the many activities that she tries and quits, including her latest attempt to learn how to play the guitar. Benita claims that she is trying to express herself, an idea at which Ruth and Mama have a laugh. They discuss the man that Benita has been dating, George Murchison. Benita gets angry as they praise George because she thinks that he is shallow. Mama and Ruth do not understand her ambivalence toward George, arguing that she should like him simply because he is rich. Benita contends that, for that very reason, any further relationship is pointless, as George's family wouldn't approve of her anyway. Benita makes the mistake of using the Lord's name in vain in front of Mama, which sparks another conversation about the extent of God's providence. Benita argues that God does not seem to help her or the family. Mama, outraged at such a pronouncement, asserts that she is head of the household and that there will be no such thoughts expressed in her home. Benita recants and leaves for school, and Mama goes to the window to tend her plant. Ruth and Mama talk about Walter and Benita, and Ruth suddenly faints. All of the characters in A Raisin in the Sun have unfulfilled dreams. These dreams mostly involve money. Although the younger family seems alienated from white middle-class culture, they harbor the same materialistic dreams as the rest of American society. In the 1950s, The stereotypical American dream was to have a house with a yard, a big car, and a happy family. The Youngers also seem to want to live this dream, though their struggle to attain any semblance of it is dramatically different from the struggle a similar suburban family might encounter, because the Youngers are not a stereotypical middle-class family. Rather, they live in a world in which being middle class is also a dream. Mama's plant symbolizes her version of this dream, because she cares for it as she cares for her family. She tries to give the plant enough light and water not only to grow but also to flourish and become beautiful, just as she attempts to provide for her family with meager yet consistent financial support. Mama also imagines a garden that she can tend along with her dream house. The small potted plant acts as a temporary stand-in for her much larger dream. Her relentless care for the plant represents her protection of her dream. Despite her cramped living situation and the lifetime of hard work that she has endured, she maintains her focus on her dream, which helps her to persevere. Still, no matter how much Mama works, the plant remains feeble, because there is so little light. Similarly, it is difficult for her to care for her family as much as she wants and to have her family members grow as much as she wants. Her dream of a house and a better life for her family remains tenuous, because it is so hard for her to see beyond her family's present situation. Benita's dream differs from Mama's in that it is, in many ways, self-serving. In her desires to express herself and to become a doctor, Benita proves an early feminist who radically views her role as self-oriented and not family-oriented. Feminism had not fully emerged into the American cultural landscape when Hanksbury wrote A Raisin in the Sun, and Benita seems a prototype for the more enthusiastic feminism of the 1960s and 1970s. She not only wants to have a career a far cry from the June Cleaver stay-at-home mom role models of the 1950s. June Cleaver was the name of the mother on Leave It to Beaver, a popular late 1950s sitcom about a stereotypical suburban family, but also desires to find her identity and pursue an independent career without relying solely on a man. She even indicates to Ruth and Mama that she might not get married, a possibility that astonishes them because it runs counter to their expectations of a woman's role. Similarly, they are befuddled by her dislike of the pretty, rich George Murchison. That Benita's attitude toward him differs from Ruth's or Mama's may result from the age difference among the three women. Mama and Benita are, of course, a generation apart, while Ruth occupies a place somewhere in the middle. Hansberry argues that Benita is the least traditional of the women because she is the youngest. The next day, Saturday, the Youngers are cleaning their apartment and waiting for the insurance check to arrive. Walter receives a phone call from his friend Willie Harris, who is coordinating the potential liquor store venture. It appears that their plan is moving smoothly. The insurance check is all Walter needs to pursue the venture. He promises to bring the money to Willie when he receives it. Meanwhile, Benita is spraying the apartment with insecticide in an attempt to rid it of cockroaches. Benita and Travis start fighting, and Benita threatens him with the spray gun. The phone rings, and Benita answers. She invites the person on the phone over to the still dirty apartment, much to Mama's chagrin. After hanging up, Benita explains to Mama that the man she has spoken to on the phone is Joseph Assagai, an African intellectual whom Benita has met at school. She and Mama discuss Benita's worries about her family's ignorance about Africa and African people. Mama believes that Africans need religious salvation from heathenism, while Benita believes that they are in greater need of political and civil salvation from French and British colonialism. Ruth returns from seeing a doctor, who has told her that she is 2 months pregnant. She reveals this information to Mama and Benita. Ruth and Benita are worried and uncertain, while Mama simply expresses her hope that the baby will be a girl. Ruth calls the doctor she, which arouses Mama's suspicion because their family doctor is a man. Ruth feels ill and anxious about her pregnancy. Mama tries to help her relax. Asagawa visits Benita, and they spend some time together by themselves. He brings her some Nigerian clothing and music as gifts. As Benita tries on one of the robes, Asagawa asks about her straightened hair. He implies that her hairstyle is too American and unnatural, and he wonders how it got that way. Benita says that her hair was once like his, but that she finds it too raw that way. He teases her a bit about being very serious about finding her identity, particularly her African identity, through him. Asagawa obviously cares for Benita very much, and he wonders why Benita does not have the same feeling for him. She explains that she is looking for more than storybook love. She wants to become an independent and liberated woman. Asagawa scorns her wish, much to Benita's disappointment. Mama comes into the room, and Benita introduces her to Asagawa. Mama then recites Benita's views on Africa and African people as best she can. When Asagawa says goodbye, he calls Benita by a nickname, Alayo. He explains that it is a word from his African tribal language, roughly translated to mean one for whom bread food is not enough. He leaves, having charmed both women. Finally, the check arrives. Walter returns home and wants to talk about his liquor store plans. Ruth wants to discuss her pregnancy with him and becomes upset when he will not listen. She shuts herself into their bedroom. Mama sits down with Walter, who is upset by and ashamed of his poverty, his job as a chauffeur, and his lack of upward mobility. Finally, Mama tells him that Ruth is pregnant and that she fears that Ruth is considering having an abortion. Walter does not believe that Ruth would do such a thing until Ruth comes out of the bedroom to confirm that she has made a down payment on the service. Later on the same Saturday, Benita emerges from her room cloaked in the Nigerian clothes that Asagawa has brought her. She dances around the apartment, claiming to be performing a tribal dance while shouting Okomogosie and singing. Ruth finds Benita's pageantry silly and questions her about it. Meanwhile, Walter returns home drunk. He sees Benita all dressed up and acts out some made-up tribal rituals with her, at one point standing on a table and pronouncing himself Flaming Spear. Ruth looks on wearily. George Murchison arrives to pick up Benita. Benita removes her headdress to reveal that she has cut off most of her hair, leaving only an unstraightened afro. Everyone is shocked, amazed, and slightly disappointed with Benita, prompting a fierce discussion between Benita and George about the importance of their African heritage. Benita goes to change for the theater, and Walter talks to George about business plans. George does not seem interested. Walter then becomes belligerent as he makes fun of George's white shoes. Embarrassed, Ruth explains that the white shoes are part of the college style. George obviously looks down on Walter, calling him Prometheus, and Walter gets even angrier at him. George and Benita finally leave, and Ruth and Walter then begin to fight about Walter going out, spending money, and interacting with people like Willie Harris. They do begin to make up, though, by acknowledging that a great distance has grown between them. Mama comes home and announces that she has put a down payment on a house with some of the insurance money. Ruth is elated to hear this news because she too dreams of moving out of their current apartment and into a more respectable home. Meanwhile, Walter is noticeably upset because he wants to put all the money into the liquor store venture. They all become worried when they hear that the house is in Cleburne Park, an entirely white neighborhood. Mama asks for their understanding it was the only house that they could afford. She feels she needs to buy the house to hold the family together. Ruth regains her pleasure and rejoices, but Walter feels betrayed, his dream swept under the table. Walter makes Mama feel guilty, saying that she has crushed his dream. He goes quickly to his bedroom, and Mama remains sitting and worrying. Benita's exploration of her African heritage and her entrance with her Afro and Nigerian garb were perhaps the first such appearance on an American stage. Hansberry creates a radical character in Benita, one who does not willingly submit to what she calls oppressive white culture. Since the audience for this play's initial run was mostly white, such a threat to white dominance was extremely revolutionary. The dancing scene with Benita and Walter is difficult to interpret, as the drunken Walter seems to mock the African dances and practices, while Benita seems not to comprehend this mocking. In addition, Benita's fight with George and the rest of her family represents a larger battle within the black community over whether to enhance and celebrate their differences from whites or whether to join white culture and try to elevate their status within it. This desire to join white culture, referred to as assimilationism, was a contentious issue for the black community in the 1950s and 1960s. The overall tone of this scene seems to be anti-assimilationist, that is, the scene seems to value Benita's expression of her cultural roots. Benita's two suitors embody this dichotomy between the conflicting identities available to blacks, the identity that seeks assimilation and the identity that rejects assimilation. This scene separates George and Assagai into completely different categories, where George, as his common name suggests, represents a black person assimilating into the white world, while Assagai, with his ethnically rich name, stands for the new Africanist culture that those who oppose assimilation pursue. As Benita dances in a robe that Assagai gives her, George deems her interest in her African roots absurd. His comments put him further at odds with Benita, and she begins to feel more of an affinity with Assagai and her African roots than with George and what she considers to be his false roots in American society. On a Friday night a few weeks later, Benita and George return from a date. The younger's apartment is full of moving boxes. George wants to kiss Benita, but she does not want to kiss. Rather, she wants to engage George in a conversation about the plight of African Americans. It seems that George wants to marry a nice, simple, sophisticated girl. Mama comes in as Benita kicks him out. Mama asks if she had a good time with George, and Benita tells her that George is a fool. Mama replies, "I guess you better not waste your time with no fools." Benita appreciates her mother's support. Mrs. Johnson, the younger's neighbor, visits. Mama and Ruth offer her food and drink, and she gladly accepts. She has come to visit to tell them about a black family who has been bombed out of their home in a white neighborhood. She is generally insensitive and unable to speak in a civil manner. She predicts that the youngers will also be scared out of the all-white neighborhood once they move in, and insults much of the family by calling them a proud-acting bunch of colored folks. She then quotes Booker T. Washington, a famous African-American thinker and assimilationist. A frustrated and angered Mama retaliates by calling him a fool. Mrs. Johnson leaves the apartment. Walter's boss calls, telling Ruth that Walter has not been to work in 3 days. Walter explains that he has been wandering all day, often way into the country, and drinking all night at a bar with a jazz duo that he loves. He says that he feels depressed, despondent, and useless as the man of the family. He feels that his job is no better than a slave's job. Mama feels guilty for his unhappiness and tells him that she has never done anything to hurt her children. She gives him the remaining $6,500 of the insurance money, telling him to deposit $3,000 for Benita's education and to keep the last $3,500. With this money, Mama says, Walter should become and should act like he has become the head of the family. Walter suddenly becomes more confident and energized. He talks to Travis about his plans, saying that he is going to make a transaction that will make them rich. Walter's excitement builds as he describes his dream of their future house and cars, as well as Travis's potential college education. In Benita and George's conversation, Hansberry reveals two sets of values regarding education. Benita believes in education as a means to understanding and self-fulfillment, while George sees education as a means to get a good job. The difference in their views about education displays a deeper divergence between the two, one of idealism versus pragmatism. Benita believes that society must be changed through self-knowledge and, thus, through consciousness and celebration of one's heritage. George and his family, however, believe that they should become wealthy and perhaps achieve respect through their economic status, which demands a certain degree of assimilation into the dominant, white culture. Though George's wealth and bearing impress Mama at first, she eventually shares Benita's point of view. Indeed, in the episode with Mrs. Johnson, it becomes clear that Mama agrees with Benita far more than one might expect. This scene portrays both George Murchison and Booker T. Washington as assimilationists, and Mama refers to them both as fools. While Mama calls George a fool only in response to Benita's remark, her branding of Booker T. Washington with such an insult has profound historical and cultural implications. Washington, historically a hero to many in the black community, preached assimilation into mainstream America as the primary goal of African Americans. Though he attained great stature in the first half of the 20th century, public opinion had turned against him by the late 1950s. Many African Americans had begun to reject assimilationist ideals, believing by this time that mainstream America would always mean white America, and that assimilating into this culture would always mean degrading themselves to fit white society's perceptions of how blacks should be and act. These African Americans thus sought an independent identity that would allow them to embrace and express their heritage and culture. The scene closes with Walter's description to Travis of his materialistic fantasy about the future. Walter still wants to be a part of the culture that excludes him. He wants to be rich if being rich is the solution to his family's problems. Most of all, he wants his son to have a better life than he has had and wants to provide him with the education he deserves. His wish for Travis seems selfish as well. He wants desperately to feel like a man, and he believes that Travis's success would reflect on his own success as the man of the house. On Saturday, a week later, it is moving day. Ruth shows Benita the curtains she has bought for the new house and tells her that the first thing she is going to do in their new house is take a long bath in their very own bathroom. Ruth comments on the changed mood around the household, noting that she and Walter even went out to the movies and held hands the previous evening. Walter comes in and dances with Ruth. Benita teases them about acting in a stereotypical fashion, but does not really mean any harm. Ruth and Walter understand and join in the light-hearted teasing, and Walter claims that Benita talks about nothing but race. A middle-aged white man named Carl Lindner appears at the door. He is a representative from the Cleburne Park Improvement Association, and he tells the youngers that problems arise when different kinds of people do not sit down and talk to each other. The youngers agree, until he reveals that he and the neighborhood coalition believe that the youngers' presence in Cleburne Park would destroy the community there. The current residents are all white, working-class people who do not want anything to threaten the dream that they have for their community. Mr. Lindner tells the Youngers that the association is prepared to offer them more money than they are to pay for the house in exchange for not moving to Cleburne Park. Ruth, Benita, and Walter all become very upset, but they manage to control their anger. Walter firmly tells Mr. Lindner that they will not accept the offer and urges Mr. Lindner to leave immediately. When Mama comes home, Walter, Ruth, and Benita tell her about Mr. Lindner's visit. It shocks and worries her, but she supports their decision to refuse the buyout offer. Then, as she is making sure that her plant is well packed for the trip, the rest of the family surprises her with gifts of gardening tools and a huge gardening hat. Mama has never received presents other than at Christmas, and she is touched by her family's generosity. Just as the whole family begins to celebrate, Bobo, one of Walter's friends, arrives. After some stumbling, he announces that Willie Harris has run off with all of the money that Walter invested in the liquor store deal. It turns out that Walter had invested not only his $3,500 but also the $3,000 intended for Benita's education. Mama is livid and begins to beat Walter in the face. Benita breaks them up. Weakness overcomes Mama, and she thinks about the hard labor her husband endured in order to earn the money for them. She prays ardently for strength. This scene presents two conflicts and worries for the Youngers and their future. First, the incident with Mr. Lindner of the Cleburne Park Improvement Association reveals the power of both dreams and racial prejudice. Mr. Lindner's comments do not intimidate the members of the Younger family. Rather, they seem to expect the conflict. The Youngers know that they are about to achieve some of their dreams and are not going to let racism get in their way. Mama's careful packing of her plant when she hears of the incident shows she is proud of her fortitude in holding on to her dream. She knows that she needs a token of the dream's power in order to face hardship in the all-white neighborhood. The plant symbolizes her dream of escaping from their poverty-stricken life. It also represents a dream for African American equality and acceptance in the general culture. In addition, this episode shows that the fact that Mama holds on to her dream is as important as the realization of this dream. The second conflict, Walter's duplicitous investment of the insurance money and its disastrous result, evokes much greater strife and discord. When Bobo arrives and announces that the money is gone, Walter yells, "That money is mad out of my father's flesh," reflecting his belief that money is the lifeblood of human existence. None of the Youngers feels pity for Walter, and it seems now that none of their dreams will come true. Ruth and Benita reach a new low of depression and pessimism. While Mama protests at first, she seems to agree with their attitude when she talks about watching her husband wither from hard work. In the face of the loss of the money, Mama's idealism about family falters. Mama's sudden sad realization that her husband's life boils down to a stack of paper bills compels her to turn on Walter as if he had killed his father himself. This anger is uncommon for Mama, and it is significant because it demonstrates that her compassion is not born of passivity. She cares too much for the memory of her husband, for their mutual dream of buying a home, and for her family to let Walter off the hook. Her beating him is the only way for her to force Walter to realize his mistakes and to look for a way to correct them. Though the other characters talk about Willie Harris, the man who runs away with Walter's and Bobo's money, he never makes an appearance on stage. Willie remains a faceless symbol for Walter's negligence and risky handling of the money. Moreover, Hansberry's focus is not on the act of theft, but rather on the Younger family and the reactions of its members to adversity. 1 hour later on moving day, everyone is still melancholy. The stage directions indicate that even the light in the apartment looks gray. Walter sits alone and thinks. Asagai comes to help them pack and finds Benita questioning her choice of becoming a doctor. She no longer believes that she can help people. Instead of feeling idealistic about demanding equality for African Americans and freeing Africans from the French and English colonizers, she now broods about basic human misery. Never-ending human misery demoralizes her, and she no longer sees a reason to fight against it. Asagai reprimands her for her lack of idealism and her attachment to the money from her father's death. He tells Benita about his dream to return to Africa and help bring positive changes. He gets her excited about reform again and asks her to go home with him to Africa, saying that eventually it would be as if she had only been away for a day. He leaves her alone to think about his proposition. Walter rushes in from the bedroom and out the door amid a sarcastic monologue from Benita. Mama enters and announces that they are not going to move. Ruth protests. Walter returns, having called Mr. Lindner and invited him back to the apartment. He intends to take his offer of money in exchange for not moving to Cleburne Park. Everyone objects to this plan, arguing that they have too much pride to accept not being able to live somewhere because of their race. Walter, very agitated, puts on an act, imitating the stereotype of a black male servant. When he finally exits, Mama declares that he has died inside. Benita decides that he is no longer her brother, but Mama reminds her to love him, especially when he is so downtrodden. The movers and Mr. Lindner arrive. Mama tells Walter to deal with Mr. Lindner, who is laying out contracts for Walter to sign. Walter starts hesitantly, but soon we see that he has changed his mind about taking Mr. Lindner's money. His speech builds in power. He tells Mr. Lindner that the Youngers are proud and hardworking and intend to move into their new house. Mr. Lindner appeals to Mama, who defers to Walter's statement. Ultimately, Mr. Lindner leaves with his papers unsigned. Everyone finishes packing up as the movers come to take the furniture. Mama tells Ruth that she thinks Walter has finally become a man by standing up to Mr. Lindner. Ruth agrees and is noticeably proud of her husband. Mama, who is the last to leave, looks for a moment at the empty apartment. Then she leaves, bringing her plant with her. Though this act begins in despair, the Youngers regain hope and motivation to pursue their dreams as it continues. Asagai renews Benita's courage and pride. His discussion of colonial Africa and his stated belief that the ruling powers must fall predicts the unrest that was to occur in those countries in the decades following the 1950s. Asagai's claim that when Benita arrives in Africa she will feel as if she has been gone for only a day is a claim that America can never be home to blacks, no matter how long they have lived there. Asagai's radicalism, which Hanksbury seems to endorse, is somewhat problematic. As an extreme position of anti-assimilationism, Asagai's views differ little from self-segregation. In practical terms, Asagai's desire to leave white America and Mr. Lindner's desire to keep African Americans out of his neighborhood have a similar basis: the rejection of integration. Each man wants to preserve his notion of cultural identity, one through returning to an African homeland and the other through racist extortion tactics. After all, as a Nigerian, Asagai has a distinct cultural identity to preserve, and arguably, Mr. Lindner has one as well. But Benita, as a Black American, does not have a clear-cut cultural identity. Her ancestry may originate in Africa, but she has never been there. She and her immediate relatives have all grown up in Chicago. Though racial lines definitely exist between the area in which the Youngers currently live and the area to which they plan to move, the working-class neighborhood of Cleburne Park is clearly not an entire world away from the South Side. In harmony with an age-old argument about racial identity, It seems that the color lines that engender wrongful prejudice on the part of some white society at large are being reinforced by a movement, black anti-assimilationism, to establish a minority characterized by those lines. Benita, after all, understands the working class plight and language of the white people of Cleburne Park, while she is, at least initially, wholly ignorant of the language and customs of West Africa. While Hansberry seems to use Assegai and Benita to make a radical point about race, she also returns Benita to a conservative position in terms of her feminism. Whereas Benita claims at the beginning of the play that she might not marry, Assegai's marriage proposal sweeps her off of her feet. According to the stage directions, she mentions it to her mother, girlishly and unreasonably trying to pursue the conversation. From a feminist perspective, Hansberry seems to abandon Benita's development. The status of Benita's education remains ambiguous, but it is clear that she intends to accept Assegai's proposal, his beliefs, and his dreams. She maintains her independence from female convention by accepting Assegai and rejecting the financially secure and socially acceptable George Murchison. Other aspects of her previously expressed self-reliance and strong beliefs in education remain unresolved. One of Benita's fellow students and one of her suitors, Assegai, is from Nigeria, and throughout the play he provides an international perspective. Proud of his African heritage, he hopes to return to Nigeria to help bring about positive change and modern advancements. He tries to teach Benita about her heritage as well. He stands in obvious contrast to Benita's other suitor, George Murchison, who is an arrogant African American who has succeeded in life by assimilating to the white world. Though Assegai criticizes Benita a few times in the play, he seems to do so out of a desire to help her. He criticizes her straightened hair, which resembles Caucasian hair, and persuades her to cut it and keep a more natural, more African look. He criticizes her independent views, but seemingly only to give her new energy and strength. His final criticism of Benita that she is not as independent as she believes herself to be because her dream of attending medical school is bound up in the insurance money from her father's death, and her reliance on Walter's investing schemes further helps to open Benita's eyes to the necessity of probing her own existence and identity. The text's implication that Benita intends to accept Assegai's proposal of marriage and move to Nigeria with him suggests that he is, in a way, a savior for her. Benita is an attractive college student who provides a young, independent, feminist perspective, and her desire to become a doctor demonstrates her great ambition. Throughout the play, she searches for her identity. She dates two very different men, Joseph Assegai and George Murchison. She is at her happiest with Assegai, her Nigerian boyfriend, who has nicknamed her Alayo, which means one for whom bread food is not enough. She is at her most depressed and angry with George, her pompous, affluent African-American boyfriend. She identifies much more with Assegai's interest in rediscovering his African roots than with George's interest in assimilating into white culture. Benita prides herself on being independent. Assegai criticizes her for being both too independent by not wanting to marry and too dependent by not wanting to leave America. Assegai's wish that Benita be quieter and less ambitious obviously outrages her. And his contention late in the play that she has been far from independent, she has had to rely on the insurance money from her father's death and the investments made by her brother to realize her dream of becoming a doctor greatly influences her. When she realizes this dependence, she gains a new perspective on her dream and a new energy to attain it in her own way. This realization also brings her closer to Walter. While she earlier blames him for his shoddy investing and questions his manhood, she eventually recognizes his strength, a sign that she has become able to appreciate him. Lorraine Hansberry was born in Chicago on May 19, 1930, the youngest of 4 children. Her parents were well-educated, successful black citizens who publicly fought discrimination against black people. When Hansberry was a child, she and her family lived in a black neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. During this era, segregation, the enforced separation of whites and blacks, was still legal and widespread throughout the South. Northern states, including Hansberry's own Illinois, had no official policy of segregation, but they were generally self-segregated along racial and economic lines. Chicago was a striking example of a city carved into strictly divided black and white neighborhoods. Hansberry's family became one of the first to move into a white neighborhood, but Hansberry still attended a segregated public school for blacks. When neighbors struck at them with threats of violence and legal action, the Hansberrys defended themselves. Hansberry's father successfully brought his case all the way to the Supreme Court. Hansberry wrote that she always felt the inclination to record her experiences. At times, her writing, including A Raisin in the Sun, is recognizably autobiographical. She was one of the first playwrights to create realistic portraits of African American life. When A Raisin in the Sun opened in March 1959, it met with great praise from white and black audience members alike. Arguably the first play to portray black characters, themes, and conflicts in a natural and realistic manner, A Raisin in the Sun received the New York Drama Critics Circle Award for Best Play of the Year. Hansberry was the youngest playwright, the 5th woman, and the only black writer at that point to win the award. She used her new fame to help bring attention to the American civil rights movement as well as African struggles for independence from colonialism. Her promising career was cut short when she died from cancer in 1965, at the age of 34. A Raisin in the Sun can be considered a turning point in American art, because it addresses so many issues important during the 1950s in the United States. The 1950s are widely mocked in modern times as an age of complacency and conformism, symbolized by the growth of suburbs and commercial culture that began in that decade. Such a view, however, is superficial at best. Beneath the economic prosperity that characterized America in the years following World War II roiled growing domestic and racial tension. The stereotype of 1950s America as a land of happy housewives and blacks content with their inferior status resulted in an upswell of social resentment that would finally find public voice in the civil rights and feminist movements of the 1960s. A Raisin in the Sun, first performed as the conservative 1950s slid into the radical 60s, explores both of these vital issues. A Raisin in the Sun was a revolutionary work for its time. Hansberry creates in the younger family one of the first honest depictions of a black family on an American stage, in an age when predominantly black audiences simply did not exist. Before this play, African American roles, usually small and comedic, largely employed ethnic stereotypes. Hansberry, however, shows an entire black family in a realistic light, one that is unflattering and far from comedic. She uses black vernacular throughout the play and broaches important issues and conflicts, such as poverty, discrimination, and the construction of African American racial identity. A Raisin in the Sun explores not only the tension between white and black society but also the strain within the black community over how to react to an oppressive white community. Hansberry's drama asks difficult questions about assimilation and identity. Through the character of Joseph Assagai, Hansberry reveals a trend toward celebrating African heritage. As he calls for a native revolt in his homeland, she seems to predict the anti-colonial struggles in African countries of the upcoming decades, as well as the inevitability and necessity of integration. Hansberry also addressed feminist questions ahead of their time in A Raisin in the Sun. Through the character of Benita, Hansberry proposes that marriage is not necessary for women and that women can and should have ambitious career goals. She even approaches an abortion debate, allowing the topic of abortion to enter the action in an era when abortion was illegal. Of course, one of her most radical statements was simply the writing and production of the play No Small Feat given her status as a young, black woman in the 1950s. All of this idealism about race and gender relations boils down to a larger, timeless point that dreams are crucial. In fact, Hansberry's play focuses primarily on the dreams driving and motivating its main characters. These dreams function in positive ways, by lifting their minds from their hard work and tough lifestyle, and in negative ways, by creating in them even more dissatisfaction with their present situations. For the most part, however, the negative dreams come from placing emphasis on materialistic goals rather than on familial pride and happiness. Hansberry seems to argue that as long as people attempt to do their best for their families, they can lift each other up. A Raisin in the Sun remains important as a cultural document of a crucial period in American history as well as for the continued debate over racial and gender issues that it has helped spark. Lorraine Hansberry took the title of A Raisin in the Sun from a line in Langston Hughes's famous 1951 poem Harlem, A Dream Deferred. Hughes was a prominent black poet during the 1920s Harlem Renaissance in New York City, during which black artists of all kinds, musicians, poets, writers gave innovative voices to their personal and cultural experiences. The Harlem Renaissance was a time of immense promise and hopefulness for black artists, as their efforts were noticed and applauded across the United States. In fact, the 1920s are known to history as the Jazz Age, since that musical form, created by a vanguard of black musicians, gained immense national popularity during the period and seemed to embody the exuberance and excitement of the decade. The Harlem Renaissance and the positive national response to the art it produced seemed to herald the possibility of a new age of acceptance for blacks in America. Langston Hughes was one of the brightest lights of the Harlem Renaissance, and his poems and essays celebrate black culture, creativity, and strength. However, Hughes wrote Harlem in 1951, 20 years after the Great Depression crushed the Harlem Renaissance and devastated black communities more terribly than any other group in the United States. In addition, the post-World War II years of the 1950s were characterized by white flight, in which whites fled the cities in favor of the rapidly growing suburbs. Blacks were often left behind in deteriorating cities, and were unwelcome in the suburbs. In a time of renewed prosperity, blacks were for the most part left behind. Harlem captures the tension between the need for black expression and the impossibility of that expression because of American society's oppression of its black population. In the poem, Hughes asks whether a dream deferred, a dream put on hold withers up, like a raisin in the sun. His lines confront the racist and dehumanizing attitude prevalent in American society before the civil rights movement of the 1960s that black desires and ambitions were, at best, unimportant and should be ignored, and at worst, should be forcibly resisted. His closing rhetorical question, or does a dream deferred explode, is incendiary, a bold statement that the suppression of black dreams might result in an eruption. It implicitly places the blame for this possible eruption on the oppressive society that forces the dream to be deferred. Hansberry's reference to Hughes's poem in her play's title highlights the importance of dreams in A Raisin in the Sun and the struggle that her characters face to realize their individual dreams. a struggle inextricably tied to the more fundamental Black dream of equality in America. Mama is Walter and Benita's sensitive mother and the head of the younger household. She demands that members of her family respect themselves and take pride in their dreams. Mama requires that the apartment in which they live always be neat and polished. She stands up for her beliefs and provides perspective from an older generation. She believes in striving to succeed while maintaining her moral boundaries. She rejects Benita's progressive and seemingly unchristian sentiments about God, and Ruth's consideration of an abortion disappoints her. Similarly, when Walter comes to her with his idea to invest in the liquor store venture, she condemns the idea and explains that she will not participate in such unchristian business. Money is only a means to an end for Mama. Dreams are more important to her than material wealth, and her dream is to own a house with a garden and yard in which Travis can play. Mama is the most nurturing character in the play, and she constantly reminds Walter that all she has ever wanted is to make her children happy and provide for them. She cares deeply for Walter and shows this care by giving him the remaining insurance money. She cares deeply for Ruth as well, consoling her when Walter ignores her. Mama respects Benita's assessment of George Murchison as being arrogant and self-centered, telling her daughter not to waste time with such a fool. Mama loves Travis, her grandchild, and hopes their new house will have a big yard in which he can play. She is also very fond, though in a different way, of their plant, which she tries to nurture throughout the play. A Raisin in the Sun portrays a few weeks in the life of the Youngers, an African-American family living on the south side of Chicago in the 1950s. When the play opens, the Youngers are about to receive an insurance check for $10,000. This money comes from the deceased Mr. Younger's life insurance policy. Each of the adult members of the family has an idea as to what he or she would like to do with this money. The matriarch of the family, Mama, wants to buy a house to fulfill a dream she shared with her husband. Mama's son, Walter Lee, would rather use the money to invest in a liquor store with his friends. He believes that the investment will solve the family's financial problems forever. Walter's wife, Ruth, agrees with Mama, however, and hopes that she and Walter can provide more space and opportunity for their son, Travis. Finally, Benita, Walter's sister and Mama's daughter, wants to use the money for her medical school tuition. She also wishes that her family members were not so interested in joining the white world. Benita instead tries to find her identity by looking back to the past and to Africa. As the play progresses, the Youngers clash over their competing dreams. Ruth discovers that she is pregnant, but fears that if she has the child, she will put more financial pressure on her family members. When Walter says nothing to Ruth's admission that she is considering abortion, Mama puts a down payment on a house for the whole family. She believes that a bigger, brighter dwelling will help them all. This house is in Cleburne Park, an entirely white neighborhood. When the Youngers' future neighbors find out that the Youngers are moving in, they send Mr. Lindner, from the Cleburne Park Improvement Association, to offer the Youngers money in return for staying away. The Youngers refuse the deal, even after Walter loses the rest of the money, $6,500, to his friend Willie Harris, who persuades Walter to invest in the liquor store and then runs off with his cash. In the meantime, Benita rejects her suitor, George Murchison, whom she believes to be shallow and blind to the problems of race. Subsequently, she receives a marriage proposal from her Nigerian boyfriend, Joseph Asagayi, who wants Benita to get a medical degree and move to Africa with him. Benita does not make her choice before the end of the play. The Youngers eventually move out of the apartment, fulfilling the family's long-held dream. Their future seems uncertain and slightly dangerous, but they are optimistic and determined to live a better life. They believe that they can succeed if they stick together as a family and resolve to defer their dreams no longer. As Mama's only son, Ruth's defiant husband, Travis's caring father, and Benita's belligerent brother, Walter serves as both protagonist and antagonist of the play. The plot revolves around him and the actions that he takes, and his character evolves the most during the course of the play. Most of his actions and mistakes hurt the family greatly, but his belated rise to manhood makes him a sort of hero in the last scene. Throughout the play, Walter provides an everyman perspective of the mid-20th century African-American male. He is a typical man of the family who struggles to support it and who tries to discover new, better schemes to secure its economic prosperity. Difficulties and barriers that obstruct his and his family's progress to attain that prosperity constantly frustrate Walter. He believes that money will solve all of their problems, but he is rarely successful with money. Walter often fights and argues with Ruth, Mama, and Benita. Far from being a good listener, he does not seem to understand that he must pay attention to his family members' concerns in order to help them. Eventually, he realizes that he cannot raise the family up from poverty alone, and he seeks strength in uniting with his family. Once he begins to listen to Mama and Ruth express their dreams of owning a house, he realizes that buying the house is more important for the family's welfare than getting rich quickly. Walter finally becomes a man when he stands up to Mr. Lindner and refuses the money that Mr. Lindner offers the family not to move into its dream house in a white neighborhood.